Om Tat Sat. Om Satyanandam. Om Paravak Shakti. Om. God alone exists. God alone is reality. Om. The 24th live stream teaching of SATYAVEDISM. Om. Family and friends, spiritual practice and God realization. Lssv 24. Om. Om, God in the form of what are called family and friends, co-workers, acquaintances, enemies, etc. All those labelings. Om. Have been referred to in previous teachings. But this teaching is a more concentrated form and serves as an introduction, because undoubtedly there are to be many questions about these seeming labels and relationships between the seeming forms. So this is an introduction. So there is the dreaming reality, which is not real, and there is the God reality, which is real. So the way in which the seeming bodies and the relationships that the seeming bodies have are almost diametrically opposed in the difference between fiction and reality. So in God reality, there are no friends, there is no family or families, there are no enemies, there are no friends, there are no enemies. All the dyads of juxtaposition are just constructs, mental constructs, and not real. So all those distinctions, all the relational distinctions are superimposed non-reality upon reality. And it's all consensual group dreaming as to what the roles are and depictions of the seeming bodies and the various activities of the seeming bodies are, and what the expectations, the expectationing of the seeming bodies in relation to one another. And this can lead to all sorts of, this delusion can lead to all sorts of happiness or unhappiness depending upon what sort of dreaming is occurring. Happy dreaming or nightmare dreaming, etc. Full spectrum. But in fact, all the bodies, all the body appearances, the appearances are distinct from all the narratives about the appearances. So the appearances seem real. That is the way the bodies appear to look, as seemingly separate. But again, that is illusion. When there's further investigation down to the micro, that is found to not be true. But that is how it appears. And then up to the macro as well. The various perspective views of reality, of the physical manifestation, God manifestation of reality. So within the species centrism, there is the dreaming about relationships between the bodies and what functioning those bodies serve depending on the perspective of the seeming other bodies. Now, in all of this, God should be loved within the seeming bodies. It is God that should be loved, not the misperception that there's a body that should be loved. Although the body appearance is also God, as are all the body appearances, but all of it is appearing, all of these seeming bodies are appearing within God consciousness as a unified field. So the fact that there is God within a seeming form does not mean that God is trapped in that form and cannot get out of it or is in there temporarily until the body is transmuted. God is not encapsulated in any form. God is ubiquitously distributed throughout all, because all appearance is within God. God manifest and God noumena, unseen. So in God reality, there are no distinctions of relationships of bodies. And all bodies basically in the physicality, in the goading, cannot just be sourced to a small circle, such as seemingly a family or a lineage of certain generation, first generation, second generation, or whatever, because it cannot be encapsulated. Those relationals cannot be relegated to a small source. All pushes all in God evolution. So the bodies do not simply, they appear to come from other bodies, but the bodies are comprised of all sorts of environmental elements, such as what is ingested as food. So the bodies are trees, the bodies are the various foods that are eaten, the bodies are the water that's imbibed, the bodies are the earth, the bodies are the sun, the bodies are the galaxy, it goes on and on. So there is there's no limiting the body appearances to be only of this body from that body. It's false distinctioning. There seems to be a DNA lineage, but that DNA lineage is not, it is extensive to an omniversal DNA, etc. Just, it goes on and on and on, and it cannot be sourced in that way of relegating it to a small source. So bodies seem to be coming from other bodies, but those bodies are coming from all sorts of other sourcing, and it's endless. Now it is more so with what are called families that the distinctionings are in fiction are more formed, where there is seeming parent bodies, seeming sibling bodies, seeming grandparent bodies, etc. And usually there's some gendering of those bodies referenced and all. So this comes from the limiting of basically believing in being a body and the belief in other bodies, and then the limitations that are placed on the thought about those other bodies as being in proximity in relation to. So that is much more hard-coded and has some medical or DNA seeming proof of lineage, etc. Then there are what would be considered friends. So friends, the label friends in fiction would mean those bodies that were somewhat proximate, maybe not, and there had been what is called friendship bonds between bodies, some commonalities that led to there being feelings of friendliness toward other bodies, and then continued belief, consensus between one or two bodies, etc., three, of having this seeming bond. But it makes that sort of exclusive in fiction when there is referring to my friend as opposed to someone else's friend, or referring to, no, that body is not my friend and this one is, or this is a close friendship and that one is less close. What would be emotions generated, or interests, intensity of interests, or service, or various aspects of what would be entailed in friendship and what is called friendship. And then there is acquaintances that would be where the proximity of two bodies with other bodies or whatever, that could happen in the work, what is called working situations. And all of these are God activities. So a seeming God in the form of a place of employment is not just a job. It is an action of God, and all the seeming bodies within it are God apparent. And the building is God, and everything is God. So, but within the dreaming, it does not appear that way. It appears that everything, all these bodies are separate, and they all have relations to one another, distinct relations, etc. So this is concerning all the perspectivism within the dreaming about what bodies are in relation to what other bodies. God in the form of seeming co-worker bodies, or this. Some of these labelings relate to what activities are occurring and what commonality the bodies are being proximate within. So employment would be the bodies are together seemingly, and that would be considered co-workers. The body is given a label within the context of a certain activity, but the body seemingly has countless labels within countless activities. There could be playing of a sport of the body, and that could be called tennis, and then there would be tennis mate, and the body would have the label of tennis mate instead, etc. So there are various activities where there's commonalities, and somehow or other they're referred to within context. This happens with God, with the happening of what's called the news, when there's some event that is seemingly depicted, like for instance a skiing accident. Then the body that is within the skiing accident is called the skier. A skier was injured by skiing into a tree. Usually there isn't a name, and there's no other context to the body except how the body was injured. the skier, as if that's all there is for that body. So it can be very limiting and not real, the language being used. And then there's the expectationing attached to the language. So what is a friend? What is considered a friend? There are all sorts of definitions and criteria, and there seem to be in the dreaming very little consensus about what would be even called a true friend, which is not real. All sorts of categories of what friendship is. And that extends to, again, family. Family being also what would be called significant others, spouses, or not officially, but significant others, etc., what are called that in fiction. And then there's legal representation of what those relationships are, with legal ramifications as to what rights and privileges those seeming bodies have dependent upon the relationships of those bodies, and in certain contexts as well. And this goes on and on and on. No, not to even, well, to mention even other relationships to other objects, let alone the species fiction, which is focused on these groupings, these fictional groupings of appearances. So then there'd be objects that would be extended to objects, relationships with objects. That is my car, that is my house, that is my pet, as if applying ownership and agency, and all of that being untrue. But that is how it's felt within the hypnotism and the dreaming. That is, it's very seeming real within the dreaming. All these mental constructs and relationships and expectations. And this is why the expectations, when those expectationings are not met, because it's dreaming fiction and usually there is not consensus, then there's bound to be disappointment. And that causes all sorts of argumentation and dysfunctionality, etc. Sometimes the commonality, though, plays out well, though, seemingly. So the fact is that all of those bodies, although appearing to be separate, are not, made of the same substances, basically. And the consciousness within and through and everywhere is the same. And that is the realization reality, God reality. So, Om. When there are to be spiritual practicing, in order to go toward self-realization and God realization of what you are already, you, capital U, not body you. There should be learning God myself. God myself does not refer to the body that is speaking. God myself refers to the consciousness. It is in the seeming first person, the only I. And when it is spoken for seeming all at once. So that should resonate. And then there's hearing God myself in God consciousness. There does not seemingly have to be saying God yourself. God myself serves that purpose. Om. So for the purposes of spiritual practices that lead to self-realization and God realization, it is important to begin to speak of these relationships familial relationships, fraternal, from friendship relationships, seeming co-worker relationships, etc. All the seeming relationships that are not real, but appear and feel real. Because there has to be navigation of all of that, so that it can go as smoothly as possible without many obstacles, seeming obstacles, or detours, or roadblocks, or etc., to the actual spiritual practices. So ideally, these practices should be encouraged by all seeming bodies that appear in the near vicinity, etc. In other words, there should be cooperation. But in order to have that cooperation, there has to be communication. God speaking. There has to be communication. Because if there is not enough communication, then there are bound to be misunderstandings within the dreaming. So here is the first teaching for the practices to understand. In God consciousness, it has to be understood that all those seeming bodies are God myself, and that there are no differences between those bodies. So there are no enemies, there's no one who's getting in the way of anything. Even the seeming self is not getting in the way of the self, God, although it may appear, may feel like that. All bodies should be treated with respect and love and cared for. There shouldn't have to be argumentation and breaking of seeming bonds of family in dreaming in order to practice, to pursue these spiritual practices. Because this is about seeming union, not about dividing what cannot be divided and what cannot be united either, but seemingly appears that way. So these practices seemingly take some discipline and some cooperation. So there should be communication that these practices are taking place and how the practices might affect seeming relationship to others, God in the form of, in dreaming. Because the practices are taking place because there's dreaming going on. So it's assumed that you have to speak as such, but directly to always expound God truth regardless. But it is being described as that within the dreaming. So with family, there are a few conventional ways in which this can be done. One of the ways is more extreme, which is the taking of a body and bringing it to what is called retreat, or what is called ashram. So that's basically removing the body from all seeming familiar environment and relation to seeming other bodies, and placing it somewhere entirely different in infinity, in order to seemingly start afresh with the deconstruction and the purification and the dehypnotization, etc. So in certain ways, this is very optimal. But there has to be then relationship to the other seeming bodies that are within the ashram, etc., or in the retreat or whatever. So it is not what would be considered pure isolation, because there's still relationship and getting along with other bodies in proximity. But the practices can be done with much encouragement and usually with more assistance in seeming places such as that, in infinity, in the dreaming. Then there's the regular, more normal seeming option, which is to practice within the context of the environment that is used to. In other words, no change in geography, basically. Now, there are other forms. There are the body going off to travel to various countries in infinity and seek spiritual enlightenment and all of that. And there seems to be some reason why the body has to be taken from one place and put to another place. A form of looking for the exotic, basically, and looking for the sources, gurus, teachers, etc., forms or whatever. But that is not necessary, because there is so much God information now that is readily available that the body does not have to travel anywhere. So although it might be preferred that the body do so, to go to certain buildings in other seeming countries or whatever, ashrams, retreats, etc., and some of that can be very costly and prohibited by the level of monetary means. Some of it may be what would be called free. And then the quality may fluctuate based upon the resources, etc. But all of that basically is unnecessary. It may be helpful, but basically it is unnecessary, because what you are is what you are already, anywhere, which is in God, as God. So there does not have to be any traveling. There can be of the body, but there does not have to be. So in the case of God in the form of to travel to ashrams or other countries, or global travel and infinity, then the body seemingly would be in relation to other bodies that have not seemingly been met before. Now, there are no strangers. So that is a label that is referred to much in fiction, that someone is a stranger, meaning that the body has not met before, and then the body may become in relationship and acquaintance from being a stranger, etc., stay a stranger or whatever. But all of that is just dreaming, because there are no strangers, there are no acquaintances. It's all God myself. So that other body seemingly is only God myself. There are no strangers. There are no different countries. There are no countries that have not been gone to, etc. I am everywhere. Home. So that is a form of seclusion of some sort, but it is not real seclusion. There are variants of seclusion within seclusion, seemingly. The complete isolation. There are certain practices. But ultimately it is not necessary, because all is myself, God myself. So it can be done that way. And then there is, so that there would be leaving of family and friends seemingly in the dreaming. So that could be traumatic if there's the route of putting the body somewhere else. That could be traumatic for the seeming primary body and the other bodies as well. There could be, that could cause argumentation about why that's necessary, and pleading for there not to be travel and to stay, and it can cause conflict. Like, what is this for? Why does this have to be done? Everything's fine as it is. Various pleadings of the bodies to maintain the dream. Or there could be cooperation, what is called cooperation, where if there's enough communication and it's all considered with good intentions and to benefit, to be of benefit, and toward purification, and that is considered to be beneficial, then there might not be resistance. So regardless, there's the other option, which is that the body goes nowhere. And it just begins the practices. So the practices, the communication about the practices can be direct or indirect, proactive seemingly, or passive, but still communication. Because to not speak of it at all in certain cases would cause conflict and possibly suspicion and all of those other delusional, unhealthy thought configurations. So there has to be engaging in communication in order to make this as optimal as possible, to have these practices run smoothly as possible, because the practices alone may seem to be difficult, let alone having conflict from seeming others about the practices. So we want to get this, we want this be ultimately going to for God realization with cooperation. Now, it does not mean that the other seeming bodies have to be, quote, dragged into this, basically, or seemingly forced to take that on as well. There are some that it will be seen that there's no interest. So there should not be, seeming, none of the practices have anything remotely to do with coercion or forcing. So that should not be seemingly forced upon other bodies in proximity as well. So if there is meditation, if there's a practice of meditation, there is explaining what meditation is and why the body is seemingly engaged in meditation, although it is actually God meditating upon God. But what seems to be the body is engaging in meditation. Why this is so, how it is so, what the patterning might be, if it has to do with scheduling of some sort. But there should not be forcing of seeming others in proximity to engage in those, in the various practices against the will, God will. Now, however, it may be seen that some of these practices are beneficial and some of the effects may be seen, and that might encourage seeming others to go toward what seems to be causing those seeming effects, beneficial effects. Then there can be dissemination of that information to seeming others and encouragement that maybe those practices be taken up by seeming other bodies that are close, that are God myself. But really only if there is seeming openness to it, but certainly not coercion. So for instance, if there is, in fiction, if there are two seeming bodies and they're with spousal relationship, and one is engaging in God in the form of God, is engaging in various practices for purification and dehypnotization and deconstruction, etc. It may would like the assistance of the seeming other close to begin to do so as well. Then that has to be God will, not forced. There shouldn't be no ultimatums about that. Now, on the other hand, there shouldn't be the bodies dissuading the other from practicing out of, for instance, the delusional emotion of insecurity. That if the other transforms in some way, that the other body will be left, or no longer in relation in the same way, or a fear that the personality, and again, this is a pseudo-egoing, it's not real, but the personality that has been so accustomed to transforms into the behavioring would transform into something even seemingly unrecognizable. So there might be questioning of what's going on, what happened, and even others that might see a drastic change in the behavior. But the pseudo-egoing behavior basically is taught to make such structures that those habitual behaviors occur over and over and over again and can be predicted. And this is what the seeming relationships are, the relational values of that there's recognized predictableness of behavior in relation to one body in relation to another. And if that behavioring is disrupted, then there's questioning as to like why it has changed. But the nature of God consciousness, the activities within God consciousness are in truth spontaneous. There's no fixed behavior except what is manifested as such because there is belief that that behavior is to be maintained. There's belief in that behavior, so the behavior continues. But actually it's so much more fluid than that. And then when there's breaking of all of that, then there seemingly is total spontaneity, although again, all is spontaneous. All actions are spontaneous in God. All God actions. but it appears that there are behavioral reoccurrences that are otherwise known as psychological attributes of a particular body. Oh, so-and-so is kind, so-and-so does this, is like this, or is like that, because those behaviors have become predicted in some way and reoccur. So the practices are breaking through to the more spontaneous actionings. It's going to break up all of those old structurings, seemingly, although there's no such thing as old, but all of those, what might be considered ingrained programmings. The program runs as usual, so it gets predictable in the way it runs. So when these practices are breaking up the way in which that all of these programmings, these deprogramming, the programmings, so the behavior might become not as recognizable. So that can be of concern to seeming those that are considered family in the dreaming, or those that are considered friends in the dreaming. So again, ideally is to engage such and explain either proactively or passively. Proactively means strike some sort of communication, explaining or expounding upon what the practices are, why the practices are so important, and that in certain cases how there can be navigated activities certain to work around. Although this should be central, these practices should be central. The practices are so important that the practices should not be considered what would be called hobby, or around the periphery of main practices that are usually considered important in fiction and taking place daily and nightly in eternity. The practices should become the center, seemingly, of the focus, and everything else should go around it. All the activities should be seen around it. So there has to be a complete sort of reshuffling of the importance of activities, because there has to be seemingly dedication and seriousness involved in partaking in these practices. So the communication is to explain the importance. Now, there's dependent upon the seeming relation in fiction to seeming others. So those that are seemingly closer may get more explanation than those that are seemingly less close. So that's proactive. So passive would usually be relegated to those that seemingly are less close, or what would be considered acquaintances, etc. Again, it's not true. Everything is God. But in the dreaming, it seems to be how it appears. So then there would be, if there's inquiry, random inquiry from seeming friend that is not close, comes in, has not been directly informed proactively, then there might be giving information about the practicing upon inquiry. And this is where it will start to become apparent, God in the form of who is seemingly interested and who is not particularly interested. It will become apparent during the practices, and whether there are any inquiries or not, and what the behavioring is in relation to the practices being partaken in, whether there's cooperation or resistance, whether there's withdrawal. So there are all sorts of ramifications of the practices that are tangential, that are not the core, which would be how the practices are affecting within God consciousness. The seeming practicer, which is not real and is God, but the seeming practicer, that is the primary focus, and then all revolves around it as to seemingly as to what the reactionings are by seeming others. Now this also extends to, when the practices are occurring, the seeming relation of the pseudo-self to, basically God, to the other seeming bodies. So the practicing should not cause alienation. There might be seemingly physical isolationings of sorts, like when the body is put down to what's called meditate initially, although meditation ends up expanding out into all activities, but at first seems to be an isolated activity, that the body is put in isolation for periods of time in eternity. So there may be feelings of wanting to continue that, and then to go into isolation so much that there would be wanting to close out all kinds of relationships to other bodies, because there seems to be not ability to relate to those other seeming bodies anymore, because the commonalities are starting to drop. So this is a phenomenon. It can occur seemingly both ways, incoming and outgoing, in what has no inner, outer, upper, down, etc. But it feeling like that, again, that there might feel to be resistance, or just the seeming realization that the activities that were in common they're no longer of interest. Some of the activities would be fictionally based, and the activities might have been of interest while the full dreaming was going on, but then the deconstruction starts to reveal that some of these activities are very superficial or encourage dreaming. So there may be a natural dropping of certain activities based on no longer being of interest. So this works the other way around as well, because when there is no longer interest maintained, then the commonalities that are seemingly shared by other bodies, such as what's called friendships, etc., when those commonalities are no longer in effect, if there is not acceptance of perhaps some other commonalities or reasons for continued engagement, then there might be what is called friendships that fall off. And then there might be all sorts of feelings about that, because again, this can get very complicated and convoluted, but the point in these practices is to keep everything as simple as possible and not to go into all the delusional, convoluted complications. That is the main reason why in speciescentrism there's such unhappiness, because of all this expectationing of all the projectioning of what this body is to that and what this body means to this one, and if that's not fulfilled, then there's anger or hurt or whatever, because those expectations are not being met. But those expectations are not real. They're not real. So if they're not being met and they're not real, but they're expected, and it can lead to problems. So in the practices should be able to, in a sense, lead to the smoothing over of these problems, to the breaking up of these problems, because this is, in a sense, will feel like an understanding of unification of what is one already, but feeling like that in the dream, a unification, not a pushing away. So there's not a deliberate. If the practices lead to the dissolution of seeming friendships or whatever, then that can be meant to be. Just as in fiction, without practices, just in ordinary fiction, there's what's called outgrowing a friendship, or outgrowing a relationship, or no longer finding a relationship or a friendship beneficial to the seeming pseudo-self or the other pseudo-self or whatever. And then there can be disagreements about that and hurt feelings, or it can be resolved where it's just what would be called mutual, and then it's just like it can be done naturally, where there's less and less engagement, and it just dissipates, etc. So even within what's called regular normal fiction, there are all sorts of ways in which friendships can seemingly continue, evolve, if not dissipate, because some are considered superficial. So if the commonality is broken, or the behavior changes, seemingly, there's no longer engagement anymore, a reason for engagement, because the premise was superficial in the first place. So those are bound to fall. Those are bound to break up. It can be very complicated and convoluted in fiction. So, and it causes many seeming world problems, because that extends out to various groups and various countries and all the conflict and everything. But it starts at the seeming proximity level and extends out. So if there's no peace in a country, that's because there's no peace seemingly in the seeming self, pseudo self, or in the seeming those in proximity. There's no pointing to disruption in some large group and having it just be a fictional large group, and pointing to that and saying there's a problem. There has to be what would be called drilling down to the core. So the practices being engaged, it can be very unpredictable as to what the behaviorings are for the pseudo-personalities involved. All sorts of variables, seemingly. But there should not be dissuaded, should not be discouraged from pursuing. And in certain cases, the seeming body will become more peaceful, and that may affect, the peace may seeming be permeative around the seeming other bodies. The other bodies may feel the peace, the seeming peace that is starting to manifest, etc. I mean, there is the God peace that is always, but the activities of the seeming body that tend to be always disruptive start to settle down, so that peace can be felt. So there are benefits to seeming other bodies in proximity. But again, there is no predicting what the reaction is going to be, what all the various reactions are going to be for the various bodies. God in the form of. It has to be dealt with as occurs, spontaneously. So there can be explaining about what is occurring based upon which, taking pick as to which are, say, more important, even though there is no such thing in God reality. This has to keep being said. In the dreaming, there seems to be a sort of hierarchy of family importance and friendship importance, and the various levels of all that, and the various definitions of what family means and what friendship means. Now, as the practices are taking place, God in the happening of, it may become apparent that certain relationships to bodies are detrimental. And this has been mentioned before in the teachings. So, if there is any violence that is going on, or if there's constant psychic violence going on, that is demeaning to the body, that is either directly hurting the body or psychically attacking the body over and over and over and over again with no break, as what happens in some what is called in fiction dysfunctional family structures, where the only way that the bodies relate to one another is negatively, basically, or would be considered very low vibrational thought content and behavior and all. So some apparent bodies seem to appear into such configurations. And that's just what is dealt with, because that seemingly is all there is. And then there can be transcending situations such as that, because the practices will make it become very apparent, if it was not apparent before in eternity, that such behavioring is delusion and a sign of illness. So there are seeming families that perpetuate what would be considered mental illness. Even within what would be called fiction, would be depicted as such or characterized as such. But that is because all mental illness basically comes from not understanding reality. So in more dense ways or lighter ways. So it varies. There are other seeming family configurations where all the seeming bodies get along fine and are very seemingly happy, even though there's still dreaming going on. But there's much functionality and love and happiness. So, and then everything in between, basically, all sorts of instantiations of what would be considered family, which is only God. So if there is such extreme negativity and violence, etc., then it would be best upon the practices, if it became apparent, to get assistance, to get help, either within the situation and have it resolved in some way through therapy, what's called therapy, etc. What's best would be practices of realization, meditation, etc., to ask that be engaged in. But usually in situations like that, that is turned down because there's such negativity. So we might have to be resorting to what would be considered psychological or shadow work, etc., sociological venues to stop the engagement in such activities as violence and psychic violence, etc. So, but for the most part, that should not be the case. That's extreme. So if there's an extreme situation like that, then it would be best to either get help or get extricated from it, and then get help for other bodies also, because all bodies need to be helped in situations like that. There is no victim, there is no perpetrator, all need help. God in the form of. So, but for the most part, there should be cooperation. And it should be apparent that these practices are a benefit. And then there might be actually others taking the practices on in some way, or asking about it. What's making this body seem so happy? Etc. Although some of the practices are difficult. So, or it can be very seemingly difficult or strenuous or whatever, mainly because of addiction to this, addiction to that, addiction to species centrism. Now, as for what would be called, let's see, co-workers, well, as long as the work or in educational systeming, depending upon what activities are being engaged, that would be classmates or whatever. And then it becomes co-workers. All the socialization toward working that begins as educational systeming and then leads to working. The co-workers or classmates, etc., got in the form of the label put on those bodies that cannot be reduced to a label. Might feel the effects in some way, but for the most part, there need not be having to explain the practices, as long as the work or the educationing is being done and continuing with that. Unless there are what are called co-workers who end up being friends, and all label upon label, etc. So, but what is called family is more apt to understand and to be loving toward practices that are to be of benefit. It's more likely that there might be problems and complications with what are called friends. And again, the definition of friendship is very vast. It depends a lot on pseudo-perspectives as to what friend really means. And in reality, there is no such thing. Because in a sense, upon realization, all becomes friend. Even friend becomes meaningless. All is God myself. There's resonance with all. So it may appear in fiction to be that there's a seeming body that can get along with everything and everyone. So what does friend mean then? If that is what it appears to be in the dream. That there is no particular one that is more of value than another one, because what is considered friendship has been blown away so much, extended out so much into infinity, that there cannot be anything that is located that is called a friend. So that love, that commonality, is inherent in God. It becomes obvious with self-realization, but more so with God realization. But within the dreaming, there's this feeling of bodies being some sort of hierarchy of importance based on all sorts of criteria. So the criteria can just be gone into endlessly as to what and perspectivism on what friends are for, what acquaintances are, etc. And all of it's just artificial. And it actually gets in the way of the expansiveness that is to occur with the practices, where seeming everything and everyone becomes, quote, friend, or quote, family. The family is extended out to everything and everyone, or if you want to use these words, but the words end up being meaningless ultimately. So they're just being used metaphorically at the moment in eternity. Myself is friend to all. God myself is, all is family to God myself. But so drop those labels, because those labels are meaningless. That's metaphorically. So they're cannot be just pointing to bodies and saying that is my friend. So that will start to become apparent. But in the dreaming, there'll be, due to communication, proactive communication, passive communication, there's going to be feelings of fluctuation. There's going to be feelings of seeming incoming relationship and exiting relationship, of dissipation of relationship and seeming new relationship being taken on. But the practices should, that is what it might feel like, but the practices are very explicit in that that the wording as such should not be seen that way. It becomes very amorphous, in other words. Now there is going to be reaction from seeming others within the dreaming, and there'll be various different reactions. So there might be some reactions that are positive, quote unquote, like what a great, all the changes that are being made. Is going to appear that the body is going through changes, even though that is not what you are. It's God consciousness. So it's going to appear that the body is going through some changes, because that means that it's taking effect. Practices are taking effect. So of course there are going to, if there's any paying attention, it's going to be perceived. The changes are going to be perceived. The effects will seemingly be perceived. But those seeming perceivings, the pseudo-ego wings of others, God in the form of, are going to have various reactions to the changes. There may be some, again, that will reject, you know, so-and-so is not interesting anymore, or, you know, this happens with, again in fiction with substance abuse, etc. In fiction, in the dreaming, when a body stops drinking, or a body stops smoking substances or whatever, the body withdraws from intoxications, substances. So in most of species fiction, the dreaming, there are many bodies that are on one substance or another, whether it be prescriptive or seemingly self-administered, all in a sense, trying to either escape from reality or break through to some other reality in pursuit of truth, or in pursuit of entertainment, or in pursuit of the medicating to happiness from dissatisfaction, etc. There are all sorts of reasons why certain substances are imbibed in order to get relief. So in a species that has become, God in the form of, become so accustomed to self-medication that it has become normalized and consensual. And this is becoming even more so the more that the seeming drugs are legalized and all. But what happens, there's a phenomenon in the dreaming, even within the regular dreaming, which was when a body withdraws from a substance. It becomes apparent that most of the commonality in certain friendships was based on the drug and the behavior that was exhibited while the drug use was in effect. So when the substance gets withdrawn, alcohol or marijuana, etc., and then the other bodies are trying to encourage the other one to resume. Oh, no fun anymore, or one starts to speak to the other about maybe that body should stop, and that causes meaning trying to assist and help God in the form of the other, what is called friend. And that is seen as, that can be seen, misinterpreted as there's defensiveness about it. So that can be problematic. So there can be, within the dreaming. So this happens. What are called friendships break up or disintegrate based on a withdrawal of a substance, and the behavior will change pursuant. So that's just an example within fiction of something, of sometimes even a drastic behavioral change based on that. So there are friendships and even family relationships that can fall apart just from that. And on the other hand, some of those ties can seem to strengthen because of that also. So, and that's just in the fiction. So within the practicing of the various teachings, it might be apparent that those behavioral changes go seemingly both ways. Although again, it's all myself, God myself. So it'll feel that way. So there has to be preparedness for all sorts of events to happen. Hopefully not too detrimental, because the point is that this be of benefit to breaking through to God reality should be beneficial to all. So this is not the pursuit of certain practices that is going to lead to problems for the practicee, God in the form of God does all spiritual practices. God does all in reality. So there should be no expectations about this. This teaching is a way of conveying certain events that might occur or might not. But in the dreaming, it's necessary to speak these possibilities, because if and when there is resulting in it, then there can be recognition of it, and there should not be dissuading and fear about it and wanting to turn back and stop the practices if seemingly there are events that might appear not to be, that might appear to be troubling in some way. This basically is the natural, these are natural occurrences as a consequence of the teachings, of the practice of the teachings. So in extreme cases, it might feel like it can be, in extreme cases, a feeling of taking a wrecking ball to all the pseudo constructs, all that has been believed in, all the seeming relationships that seem to be real in fiction, and basically leveling it all. To see afresh with God vision the whole reality, God reality. And again, it can be easy or it can be difficult, seemingly. And there can appear to be sacrifices, like seeming sacrifices of friendships, etc. But even within fiction, there is what is called outgrowing relationships. And relationships, seemingly in fiction, if the relationships are seemingly beneficial and true to some extent, feeling, then those family and friendship, etc., feelings should continue no matter what changes seem to occur. Even if the changes seem to be very extreme, there should be acceptance, because that's what love is. God, absolute love, is the not feeling of any separation at all, because there is none. So that's God, absolute love. It would translate omnitranslationally in relativity as love for all. So love for all would translate as, no matter what the seeming changes are that occur and how the appearances might be transformed, that there is the underlying love that continues no matter what. That love is not contingent upon this or that or the other thing or the other or a certain behavior. That it not be so-and-so no longer loves so-and-so because such and such happened, or so-and-so changed, or whatever. Because that is not real love. Real love would be the feeling of unity to the point where there is no separation and nothing can change in the real self, because nothing ever changes in God Absolute. But that is self-realization and God realization. And that is not, as long as the practices go on, that is not to be expected, that there will be understanding of that level, seemingly. But it might feel like those that are still engaged and seem to be loving, no matter what changes the body and the body behavioring might appear, any transformations, etc., that there be consistency in love and engagement. So in that way, it might be determined what's important seeming relationships and what are to be let go. But again, that's within dreaming. So the practices are not about isolation and not about pushing seeming people away in the dream, not about disengaging, not about hurting others by doing so, etc. That would all be misperception of the actual practicing and what the practicing is there for, what the intent is. So again, Om, undoubtedly there is going to be further teaching about what is called family, what is called friendship, what is called coworkers, what are called classmates, what are called all the other relational labelings that are not real. But as long as there's dreaming, there are going to be questions within the dream. And some might get very specific about certain situationings and certain particular relationships that feel real. And there will be addressing of those concerns in various other teachings, especially maybe in what is called God and the Happening of live Q&A, which will be forms within the live stream teachings and at other seeming teachings possibilities that are to occur. And as always, there can be leaving of questions in the commenting to be addressed as well. So there is going to be God in the happening of the opening up of what appears to be question and answering teachings as well. So not to take any teaching as in and of itself as being definitive and case closed, that there's nothing else to be conveyed about it, because this is ongoing, and there'll be, as been stated, many live stream teachings of SATYAVEDISM. Also, the live stream teachings are to become more and more what would be considered frequent in eternity. So any apparent gaps seemingly will be closed little by little. Ideally, the live streams are to be daily in eternity, and there's working toward that. But it is a process. So the next live stream teaching, SSV 25, is to occur very soon, in eternity. So God love. God absolute love. Om. God alone exists. God alone is reality. Om. Paravak Shakti. Om. Satyanandam. Om Tat Sat.